Test 1, 2, test 1, 2. Test 1, 2, test 1, 2. Test 1, 2, test 1, 2. Test, test.
We have this soft beanbag chair with one pillow and a weighted blanket. Then we have the fluffy carpet under it and a sound machine box to make sounds. We have a table with a small mat under it. The table has kinetic sand and the mat is for so like the kinetic sand doesn't get on the fluffy carpet. We also have a lava lamp
Good evening. Welcome to this September 22, 2022 workshop of the Mansfield Board of Education. I'd like to call the meeting to order at 7:03. I'm Kathy Ward, the board chair, and I will ask April to read our mission statement, please.
It is the mission of the Mansfield Public Schools, in partnership with the Mansfield community, to ensure that each and every child develops the knowledge, skills, and dispositions essential for civic engagement and personal excellence in learning, life, and work within our local and global community.
Great. Thank you very much, April. And then I will turn this over for the Mansfield School Development Plan and Report of Progress, Knowing Students. I'll turn it over to Superintendent Dart.
Good evening, everyone. It is exciting and an honor to be here, especially tonight, to be able to talk about the district development plan and our first report of progress, Knowing Students. I'm sitting here because I get to see your faces, and what I realized last time, that when I present up there, it is hard for me to turn and check in. I think eyes are important, and I get to see you and also share information and be a little more responsive. And so I wanted to also thank many of my colleagues and our team that are here to be a part of this presentation. One of the more exciting parts of our workshops and our reports of progress is that we invite people to be a part of the compelling story, to illustrate and share practices that align to the development plan. And I'm very excited that the team felt that it was a good move to start to bring in our teachers into these meetings so that you hear not only from district leadership team, but also from the practitioners that are in the classroom, that are living and breathing and actually authoring a lot of this work. And so I'm excited about that. So tonight, we're going to look at, first of all, the second draft 2.0 of the development plan. And I'd like you just to take a look at it right now so I can help orient you to the development plan. This is year 2. However, it is a redraft because as we learn about the development plan and we work through it, we have a better understanding of what we were able to accomplish and focus on. And then how to better use this plan. This is a very different design. It continues to get a lot of attention throughout our district and also throughout the state. And I think that it's important to know how it is constructed. So on the first page, you'll see that the development plan is centered on the 6 core beliefs that are bookended by leading with equity and growing educators, and that it's organized around 3 key drivers or strategies. And if you turn the page, you're going to look at something that looks like this. And this is a new graphic for us. We realized last year, as we were working through the plan, that the 3 key drivers, know students, support the whole child, ensure deep learning, are more cyclical and interactive than linear. The old diagram showed it kind of in order. And we felt that when we enter into the work, the first thing that we do is we get to know our students. And then once we know our students, we start to begin to develop the supports. And if we know our students and we develop the supports, then we ensure deep learning, right? That there is a process and there is an order to it, although they're interconnected. I want to do just a little bit of teaching in the sense about the instructional core that is also related to those key drivers and core beliefs. So when we think about the most important essence of our work, we think of the instructional core, which is the teacher, the student, and the task. This isn't actually in your book, it's in the slides. And the instructional core is recognizing that the the most key ingredients and the thing that's most closely related to our business is really what is the teacher doing, what is the student doing, and what is the task or the curriculum or the content doing, and how do they interact. That's called the instructional core, and that's something that we often talk about. But when we start thinking about that instructional core in relationship to our key drivers, we see that the interrelationship between the teacher and the student is really about knowing students, how we build relationships, build trust. And that when we start to think of the student interacting with the task, that's really how we support students. And we build this idea of relevance, right? Because now I know my kid, I know what they need, I know what the next step is. I also know something about what they're interested in, what connects with them. And then once we have those two things in place, we really can think about the interrelationship between the teacher and the task. The teacher's designing a task to ensure deep learning, and that we always want to move along this trajectory of rigor. We want the child to be challenged. And so the instructional core is super important to the development plan because the absolute outcome would be these deep learning outcomes. So once we know that students are engaged, we know them, we know how to support them, we know what they need, we know that they're involved in deep learning, we then should be able to shift our focus on, well, what are the outcomes? So what? What happened? How do we measure that? How do we acknowledge that? So the instructional core relates to our work. It's often what we talk about. It's not in the development plan, but I wanted you to see that overlap and know how relevant it is to us and acknowledge again that the construct of the development plan is quite relevant to the way we think and work. The last thing I wanted to share with you about kind of background information is this idea of rigor and relevance. In order for students to get to this point of deep learning, we need to think about increasing the level of rigor in the classroom tasks, but we also need to increase the relevance. And this is important when we think of the portrait of the graduate, when we think about 21st century learning, when we think about students right now who are engaged. And I'm thinking of like the Witness Stone project last year that we saw 8th grade students engage in. That was a rigorous activity. It was high on application and synthesis and evaluation, but it was also very relevant. And so that's kind of the trajectory that we want to see, that we know that we often have to start in acquisition. We need to build those foundational skills of how to read and how to write. But we also know that that quadrant D in adaptation, where we see high rigor and high relevance, is really what deep learning is about. So what is the context of Mansfield in terms of teaching and learning? We know that we have a student-centered learning definition that's actually deep learning, and that we have the portrait of the graduate. So in the district development plan, you know that we start with these things, that these are iconic artifacts that really reveal how we think students should be engaged in the classroom, what we would expect to see and hear from them. We also know, and the board has seen these things before. I know last year we presented information about our curriculum. So the curriculum splash page or the opening page shows how we think about curriculum development in terms of the content areas and the portrait of the graduate, as well as the social emotional learning, that there are guidelines in terms of how we think our students should interact in the classroom and be supported. This is background information. This is the context in which we know students, so that we think of portrait of the graduate, we think of student-centered learning, we think of how our curriculum is organized, and we think of social emotional learning with that. So in the development plan, if you would turn to the first section of know students, I want to remind the board just how this is constructed and how it interacts. So the key driver, today we're going to be talking and focused on know students. When we talk about knowing students, what we're really thinking about is data and evidence, how we build understanding of the learner, and how this informs instruction. So you can see the key driver at the top. The second part are the actions. It's almost like a theory of action. If we do these actions, right, we'll get to the indicators. The actions are focused, actionable adult work. This is what we're focused on doing because we believe if we do this, we do these actions, we will then see changes in these indicators that are off to the right. And the indicators are the data that we're going to use to measure academic, social, emotional learning, growth, and achievement. That's the then. So if we do the actions, then students will increase their understanding of content. They will see measured changes in academic growth and social emotional development. And then at the very bottom, just as a reminder, the core beliefs are threaded throughout the actions so that we're consistently thinking about how does this go back to the 6 core beliefs that are at the start of the plan. Are there any questions about the organization and the background of it? Great, awesome. So let's start with actions. In knowing students, this year, these are the actions that the district leadership team thought would best move students. This is, if we do this, then we will see improved academic and social emotional growth. So the actions that we're focused on this year are developing strategies beyond the academics to build that social emotional development and have kids have a sense of belonging, agency. We also felt that if we implement structures that develops the capacity of educators to use data, that it will help us know students, that if we have better data storage systems, it will help us. If we engage families in multiple ways to deepen our ability to know the students, so in other words, knowing families helps us know students. And then finally, if we use culturally responsive teaching practices that are relevant to the student and to the community, that it will help us further deepen our understanding of students. So those are the actions, and already this is what's happening. We see that from the Summer Social Emotional Learning Institute that I've shared with you, we now have teachers action planning and doing the work. So they had the training, they had time to start thinking about planning, and now they're doing. So you're going to hear from Dr. Patwa, who will share what teachers are actually doing as a result of the Social Emotional Learning Institute. We have teams working on student portfolios because we realize that you can't always measure deep learning in a number or in a score, that sometimes you have to look at artifacts. You have to look at a performance or an exhibition. You have to listen to their reflections. You have to look at surveys. So we want to develop a portfolio that will follow students and align to our deep learning outcomes. So we already have teachers starting to work on that and think of ways to use technology to allow that student to hold on to that portfolio over time. We are building a data dashboard, and this is, I'm just very excited. Louis, Jamie, and Candace have been working, and in a relatively short period of time, have really created a way of capturing our data, and we'll be turnkeying that over to our teachers so that they're seeing our data in a way that's relevant to the work, so that we're doing a better job using the assessments, using the information, so teachers can plan instruction based on that. So they're going to present and show you a little bit of that work. We also have teams starting to take shape to further deepen our capacity to facilitate student-led conferences. I want to thank the board again for the calendar adjustments There's great excitement in the district to acknowledge that we really needed a second conference schedule, and to have those days to support not only the ability to meet with families and students, but then to further deepen our capacity to provide student-led conferences. And then the last thing, both Principal Rodriguez and Principal Barlow are leading a read with our teacher leaders around a book titled Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, in hopes of lifting a district-wide read that will help identify specific practices that will bring culturally responsive teaching into the classroom. It will further build that capacity. So I'm going to invite Dr. Patwa up now, and she's going to talk about that SEL action planning part.
Good evening. So, thank you, Superintendent Dart. I like saying that. So the key things that you'll see, and I'm just highlighting a few of the action plans that were done as a result of the SEL Institute this summer. And just as a reminder, over 60 staff members participated in 2 sessions, and the reviews were really positive and strong. There was this emphasis throughout the Institute and in the action plans about how do we build relationships with all students? Where do we make those connections? Because as you saw in the instructional triangle, relationships are key to get to the next step of everything else that we're doing. In that process, you'll see some examples of seeking student voice, because students will let you know what they want you to know about them and how you can help them if they're asked. And then also rethinking our classroom environments, and you'll see a couple of examples of that. They're really exciting because the theme here is that all students at what we call Tier 1 benefit from some kinds of structures that meet their needs. And go to the next slide. Thanks. Oh. So as an example here, one of the thoughts of where do we get student voice? How do we know what students would like us to know about them? So one of the examples here came out of the SEL Institute was an identity circle. And we've seen it used with adults before, but this is, Betsy Parker used this in her PE class. So her thought was, I'm meeting a whole new group of kids. You know, I'm used to knowing them pre-K through, 4, but we're merging, and she's meeting a new population of kids. What's the best way to let them know what they want to know, what they want her to know? So if you could see here, it's a very simple exercise, and the theme here is the needle just moves very small, but yields a lot of great information. This child here wanted her to know that his fish died and that he broke his wrist in 1st grade. Very important for a PE class, just so that maybe he was nervous about something. So it's a launching pad for where do we go with this. On a different level, the 6th grade team is looking at a check-in sheet. So things like what brings you joy at school, what frustrates you, what helps you when you're frustrated. Different ways to elicit these responses. And sometimes it's easier to write something down than to talk to someone about it, in a direct conversation. So those are some examples there. And then I feel like I have a ringer in the audience. Some examples of the classroom environment meeting everyone's needs and building that connection. One thing that was pointed out is children's days are dictated throughout the day by someone else. So how do we design spaces that allow them to, take a beat? Maybe they need a cool down space, but within their classroom environment so that they don't have to leave their community to get that moment. And in this one, I'm just going to, So this is an example of a planning session in Brenda Moulton's class about creating a cool down space, or what do you call it? Oh, yes, okay. And it's all about student voice here, so if you'll hear some of the components.
We have this soft beanbag chair with one pillow and a weighted blanket. Then we have the fluffy carpet under it and a sound machine box to make sounds. We have a table with a small mat under it. The table has kinetic sand and the mat is for so like the kinetic sand doesn't get on the fluffy carpet. We also have a lava lamp on the table. Here is a giant whiteboard that we can use to draw on with an eraser and a marker. We have a mantra pillows over here, some books, a box of fidgets, fairy lights, a shelf, and that's it.
So, and one of the things I like is that Brenda talked about in her action planning about how she's going to model that use too. Maybe she needs a break sometime or wants to reflect on something. So another example is Val Mosley's sixth grade classroom. She set up a whole area that's in the room. It's an attractive area. It's not an isolated space. And she's already talked about how kids are using the space. Afterwards, at the end of class, she may check in with a student and say, I noticed you were there, and just kind of process with them afterwards. So all of these things are adding up to, a richer connection for the classroom teacher.
Are those two spaces in the classroom?
No, it's different angles. So this is this table here.
Right, but it doesn't,
There's the green lava lamp, and it's over there.
okay, thank you.
Okay.
Well, before you go, so again, I just want to commend the point of the SEL Institute is providing opportunity for colleagues to gather, to learn, but more importantly, to reflect on their practices. This was so successful that we had more and more people ask for it. And during the Institute, they asked that the presenter that we had brought in come back. So they'll be back in the district 5 different days, working with our teams, simply because teachers have asked for this person to help them build expertise and understanding and then contextualize it. These examples that Shamim just shared with you are super important because they not only help us address students who sometimes are dysregulated, but I'm going to share a conversation that we had in one of the institutes where a teacher was like, I didn't realize this is an equity issue, that when I would send a student out because of behavior, that student was missing opportunities for being in the classroom. And I focused too much on what was fair for the other kids versus what was fair for this one kid who was being dysregulated and just needed a space within the room so that they could hear instruction, they could be in the same area, and learn to advocate for themselves. What I really like about this is that students over time in this kind of setup will ask or advocate for themselves to check themselves out. They'll sit for a moment, get their thoughts together, and come back. We know in a traditional classroom, sometimes where there's headbutting and disagreement, it leads to an infraction and such a bold defiance or disrespect that the student sometimes was asked to leave the classroom. Doing these easy moves, which seem so intuitive to us, are actually really powerful equity moves that help kids stay in the classroom.
Do you track those kind of office referrals?
Yes, actually, that was part of the Equity Institute from last year. Bill Barlow and a team started to create data tracking for that. And then more importantly, not only collecting that information, but then disaggregating it and looking at what does this mean. And Larry has already had these really frank conversations about, let's look at this data together. Let's look at what does this mean? And Can we set goals around this? Can we identify opportunities to re-engage kids without having to use traditional consequences or traditional thinking around when students break rules or have infractions?
So at some point, will you share all that with us at the end of the year?
Sure. In
Thanks.
fact, during whole student, supporting the student, you'll see some of that data. Yes.
We actually had a kindergarten teacher at Annie Vinton actually did this in her classroom. To me, it was always a wonderful model. I just didn't understand why more of the teachers didn't do it, because it's a great idea.
You know, I do want to point out that, thank you for noting that, these are going on all over the district in many different grades. So you're right. Just having a cool down space, a quiet space, a reflection space, it's a wonderful idea.
I have to say that they changed it from the no-no spot to the cool-down spot.
Words do make a difference. Great, thank you. So another action that's related to two of our action items about the use of data, we recognized that we needed not only to build capacity, but we needed to build systems. So I'm very proud of the work from two of our directors, Director of IT, Jamie Russell, Director of Teaching and Learning, and the Dean of all buses, and former IT integrationist and math teacher, Louis Goffinet. So I'm going to invite them up to talk about Data Studio and how we are building our own data warehouse, so to speak.
So, good evening. You know, we recognize that one element of knowing students is the ability to look at real-time data to understand student strengths and their areas of need. And we really had a long discussion over the summer about what is the right tool for us that meets our needs and meets the needs of our teachers. And so one thing I developed an appreciation of last year was Louis' ability to manipulate Data Studio, which really helped us to understand how we might be able to design a tool in-house that really meets our needs and it meets the needs of our teachers and our children. So I am pleased to say and introduce Jamie Russell, Louis Goffinet, and Hope Mulholland, who joined us at Mansfield Public Schools and quickly joined the team around all things, how do we define a data set and a platform that works for our needs. We talk about 5C skills for our kids. I couldn't be more proud of this team and their ability to think about the different facets of what we needed, communicate, to collaborate, to do some of it together, some of it offline, and really think about what's best for teachers, not only from the recipient of a platform of information, but what are the best ways that they can also expend their time to get data in there in a timely and relevant manner. And so we're going to share a little bit about that with you all tonight. Data Studio is actually exactly what it sounds like. It's a platform that we've designed thinking about what is the information that we need to have in teachers' hands in the moment to help them make those important instructional moves that supports all of our learners. And so we began to think about how we build that platform, and we have actually entered some data and began to manipulate it and see and understand the different capacities and ways it can be a useful tool. We're saying right now it's in beta testing. We've been working through it with an expectation to deploy with all teachers in early October. What we love about this design is it's timely and relevant data designed to inform instructional moves. And what I mean by that is the way that we've been able to set this up. A teacher can put data in and it immediately populates within that student profile. And if for any of you that have ever worked with data platforms, that doesn't always happen. Usually there's typically some lag time between completion of assessments, entry of assessments, and what you're able to look at and see. This platform allows us to streamline that work, which is important not only for the user end of a teacher needing to see performance data, but also for the input end as well. We also really appreciate the fact that this platform allows us to customize and provide focused data at the classroom and individual level in a very user-friendly way. And it really is interactive and dynamic, and Louis and Jamie will speak to a bit of that, of how teachers can look at a classroom view, an individual view, a cohort view, and really understand their population of students and their needs. And so I am going to turn it over to the two of you to speak a little bit more.
All right. Thanks so much, Candace, and thanks for the leadership that you've shown on this. This is something we've talked about for a while. As Candace referenced, Louis really took the lead in identifying this tool last year and really generated the excitement and focused our attention on it and demonstrated what it could do. Now, having Candace in her position has really leveraged it and put us in a good spot. So we are excited to give you a sneak preview. As Candace mentioned, we've been working on this. This is a project we talked about last year, but we really put it into motion this summer, have continued now, and are preparing to hopefully share it to teachers in October. But we thought it would be fun to just, like I said, give you kind of a sneak preview and so forth. As Candace referenced, it is designed to take data and make it visual. So Louis and I are going to speak to this. It's a little overwhelming at first, so give us a second just to sort of describe a little bit what's on the screen, and then obviously talk some more about it. Yeah.
We take the next red one or stand for.
Sure. So with different assessments, this particular assessment happens to be SBAC Math. And this particular assessment happens to be the SBAC assessment for math. The way SBAC works, there are 4 bands that students would fall in. 4 happens to be the highest band, meaning highest achieving, and 1 happens to be the lowest band. Some other assessments, you might have 2 bands where it's just above standard and below standard. Other ones you could have 3. So it varies from assessment. But you picked up on one of the pieces we wanted to do was to use color to focus attention. So the way Data Studio works is each assessment gets a screen. So this happens to be the screen for math, which I mentioned happens to have the 4 bands. Another one might be FNP, which would work in a very different way. Another one might be STAR, which would work in a different way. And the idea behind that is every assessment has different types of scores and works in a different way. And so you can customize the screen to focus on the things that really matter for classroom instruction and inform instruction. So just as an overview with each one, like in this sample, at the top, there are a variety of filters that a teacher could choose. So they could look at all students who took the assessment, or they could zero in a particular group, like maybe a particular grade level or a particular at-need population, for example. And when they choose those filters, the number of students shown, which in this case is 567, would narrow down and the data would dynamically change. So a teacher could really focus on what they need to look at, including a teacher could look at the students assigned to the teacher, for example. Because sometimes you want to see performance across the grade level you work at, but sometimes you just want to look at the kids who are assigned to your classroom. The graphs then change dynamically, the data changes, and then you can act on that. For that, I'm going to pass it on next to.
It is really nice to be on this side of the booth. It's a little more exciting out here. I sort of gravitated to Data Studio last year when I realized that it's everything that people want Excel to be. And maybe that's sort of a geeky thing to get excited about. But it's been exciting to explore with Jamie and Candace just how well we can use this. And it's important for us to show you just how dynamic it can be. We've taken just a brief video highlight here where you can see us choosing a cohort of students, which in this case is current 5th graders who scored at level 1 in the spring 2022 SBAC Math. And what you see is the rest of the screen changes, so now you focus just on those, in this case, 9 students, and you can explore more about them. So below on the second half of the screen, you would see their student information, their teachers, their race and ethnicity data updates on the left, and you can see all their historic scores, which we've taken out for privacy. But it's a really powerful tool, and it's really nice that Jamie and I, with Hope, with Carly Payne, with Mike DeChico, are able to highlight the points on these huge spreadsheets that we get of assessment data from the state or from these companies, sometimes that are 40 or 50 columns wide, times 1,000 students. So we're able to just pull the data that's relevant for teachers to inform instruction and then put it in a way that's accessible to them. So it's been a really powerful tool, and I think it'll be well received by teachers. Yes.
So with this second or third graders, and look at their score before COVID and during and after. I think that age is an inflection point from what I'm reading. And if you don't grasp, or the 9-year-old doesn't grasp reading, they're going to have problems in their future education pursuits. So this is a tool where you can pull out 9-year-olds, basically probably third graders, second or third graders, and see how their reading scores are. And then if before COVID, if you have a cohort that has always been testing lower, to see how much lower they are. Oh, I'm sorry. To see how much lower they are. Just honing in on that age group, say. You could do that with this.
Sure. So the purpose of a data platform is to be able to monitor student performance over time, and we have the ability within this to monitor cohort performance, longitudinal performance of students. And while we shared an example of Smarter Balanced Assessment with you, we're actually putting other pieces of data information in there, because as you maybe remember, Smarter Balance really begins in third grade. But we know there's information that we want to make sure we're paying attention to with students that were younger than third grade. But it also allows us to look longitudinally from year to year at student performance and where might be those dips that we need to understand more about a certain subgroup of learners, as well as where are those high points, which you'll hear about in a little bit, about, okay, what did we do there that was really positive? But it is also, and I think Peter will speak to this in a little bit, the triangulation of data. We know Smarter Balanced Assessment is one data point. It's important. We also know there are other data points that we gather information about, both within district or other standardized assessments. And it's really important that we have them all housed in one location, so that we're able to look at those pieces of information, not just in isolation, but together, so they show us a true picture of where our learners are at. And so, yes, it's important to have all of that in there so that we're able to do that and track over.
Is there a way to track how many years a student has been in the district? I know the historical relevance would be kind of state reporting for some of it, but I think that especially once kids get into middle school, we do get transfers, and it's important to know if students are still scoring in the red and they've been Mansfield students all along, or if they're coming from different districts and maybe, didn't get some of that base. I think that would just be a really good reflection on how our whole system is working overall.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what you're talking about, if we're going to talk in Smarter Balance terms, is a matched cohort performance over time. With those are the students that have been our students all along. I do think that while that's not necessarily housed in this database right now, it is something that we do also pay attention to. We want to know our learners from the entry point into our district, whether they've been here all along or they're a new student to us that we know has some skill areas that we need to work on. We want to really understand their learner profile, and we do that with all of our students to really make sure that we're meeting their needs where they're at.
Jeanette?
Data, different tests in a different way. So a student might have difficulty with the SBAC, but in another kind of assessment they might perform well, so that you can determine what is the best way to help that student.
Sure. So part of the work here, I think I want to make sure I'm answering the question correctly. So you're asking us to overlay that data right in Data Studio? I'm going to.
Speak to that. So, yes, there are some ways you can do that in Data Studio where you could potentially grab a group of students that performed at a certain band, say in one assessment, and then look at how those students looked in another assessment.
Or could you do it with one student, that child's needs in an in-depth manner?
Correct. You could look at one child and do that. Now, and so in terms of the beta testing piece, the screens we've developed so far have been assessment focused. So we have on our roadmap to develop a student focused screen, which is what you're referring to. So the answer is yes, just not yet, but will be.
One other, are you able to take social emotional assessments and overlay those with performance? So say, I don't know, you did the best or something like that. Would you then be able to overlay that indicator along with their test scores?
Yeah.
So I think this brings up the point that what's really nice about Data Studio is it's all up to us. So we can pull in data from whatever sources we want, especially if we create those sources like a Google form or a survey. And we can take whatever data is important to us and find a place for it in the Data Studio. So there can be on the ultimate one student page a section that compares their academic performance to survey results from SEL.
Susanna?
I guess that was one of my questions. Amazing and wonderful, and I think helps to support us as a board. It helps with decision-making at a district level, obviously at a school level, and data teams and all of those pieces. So what are your other I have a whole list that I could think of, like attendance and nurses visits and all kinds of other things. Like, what else are you planning on? I know I'm getting greedy and you're just starting, but like, what are some of the things on your list that you are going to add in?
So I think part of that is collaboration with building administrators to really talk about what is useful and informative to your work. And so we began this work recognizing that we needed a platform for our data and our assessments that was really accessible for our staff and our teachers within the building. And we're continuing to build it out. I mean, we started this in August literally saying, we think this makes best sense. And as we started to build it, we started to develop more confidence of this is really looking like something that really will work for our district. And now we're beginning to think about, now that we know we have this capacity, how do we link this all together so that we could really build out what we call, what I'll call a profile of a learner that really shows their learner profile, not only from an academic standpoint, but from an SEL standpoint, the whole child. And we're beginning to develop that. And so as we build one piece, we're adding another piece in. And so our next phase is really having conversations at the building level of what other pieces of information are meaningful and useful, and then how do we link these all together?
That's great. I think, lots of data does not equal good data, right?
Correct.
You want to be thinking about
Absolutely.
what's going to answer your questions. But I also just wanted to comment, I really appreciate the way that you've worked to help with drill down in the data and being able to look at subgroups. And that's so helpful in terms of problem solving and like that kind of real time conversation. So it's really impressive. And I know it's, you always want a sort of unicorn that's going to do everything, but like it really looks great. So thank you.
Catherine?
Did I understand that you got this program just in August, this past August?
Well, I would say that some of us in this group have been using Data Studio for a variety of purposes. Yes, I'm looking at Louis because he started to work with Data Studio in a variety of capacities last year. Began to introduce it to myself, talked to Jamie Russell a bit about it. But it was my surface level knowledge of the work that he was doing within his classroom, in fairness, that I started the conversation of, might this be something that makes sense? And as we started to look at it and we used Louis' knowledge base in collaboration with how we enter data in, we've really begun to realize that this is a platform that we think could really work for us. Yes, in August.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
there's obviously,
We have a knowledge base there.
yeah. Going to Martha's question, though, can you put past information in there so that we could tell how COVID has affected our students as far as their learning has gone?
I mean, we certainly have started to add some past data in there. We also have other places where we're able to gather data from to look at the impacts of the pandemic on student learning. And so you have to be mindful as you're building this, how far back do you want to backfill data? What's the stop point that makes sense? And so as we're building and designing this, we're starting to think about what is the present data we want to get in there that's really relevant for this year instructionally, and what other data pieces do we have that we might want to also enter into the system.
Martha?
Yeah, I'm always concerned about the students who fall in the lower 20% of the range. And so I would be interested in figures that show, well, at COVID, a 9-year-old, now they're 11, see how, if they have, see if they have progressed or digressed in contrast to some students bloom, but some have a tougher time reading. So I'm interested in that because I want them to be good readers, so they'll be good learners. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Not also on the other side of the coin is you have some kids that COVID was a blessing in disguise because they are not necessarily good in the traditional classroom. They are better off, in a, looking on a screen and stuff. So I mean, even that kind of a comparison would be interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really exciting stuff. Thank you.
And just to echo, not only the quick turnaround, but you can purchase things to do some of this. But the problem is, it doesn't do everything, and it doesn't make you think about what you really want. And so the leadership team knew that we needed to build data literacy. We've not looked at data in a consistent way that helps us leverage change. And because of the pandemic, we've talked about learning loss. We've listened to the board ask questions about that. And we realize that as we think about supporting students, that we have to really know where they are and have a system that we can share with our teachers. And so instead of purchasing this, we really started to think about what Candace, Louie, and Jamie talked about, growing it ourselves so it does exactly what we want. And the more we use it and adapt it, the stronger we get with data. They often talk about DRIP syndrome, data-rich, information poor. That actually when you look at districts, they end up sitting on a lot of data that they do nothing with, that they don't have capacity to look at. The beauty of this system is actually all of your questions will have us go back to the drawing board of like, yeah, let's look at what is the effect of attendance on achievement? What is the effect of attendance on achievement during the pandemic? And hopefully the pandemic and events like that have passed, but we know their effects could linger. And we need a better way to make sure that we are using data to do our job. And it's not that we didn't before, but again, we see an opportunity to be consistent and to leverage it in a way that honors the district development plan of knowing students. We have to build capacity around this. So I applaud Candace, Jamie, Louie, Hope, all those folks that have built this. Our next step is to continue to build it and then build a professional learning plan so that teachers are then using it and having this data be a part of their instructional planning. What do kids need? Where are they? And how will we measure that? So exciting stuff. We're going to talk a lot about data in our next portion. So knowing students is really looking at data. And I want you to take a look at the indicators, because if we do those actions, like building a data platform, then we should see the adult actions have an impact on student indicators. This is like our dashboard. So if you want to know how well I'm doing, I want you to pay attention to these districts, because this is what we're paying attention to. How is the performance of students on state and local academic assessments? What's happening with attendance? What does our demographic data suggest? Enrollment, those changes that you were talking about. Do we see an effect of students who transfer? We want to know what the climate data is, and we want to know what the collaborative data analysis, what are teachers doing with that data, and how is that informing and impacting student achievement? I recall last year when we had this report, we talked about satellite data, map data, and street data. This is coming from a book titled Street Data, Next Generation Model for Equity, Pedagogy, and School Transformation. We love it because it's an easy way to remind ourselves that you have to triangulate. Candace talked about not paying attention to one number, but the interaction of data in a constellation. So we look at satellite data. That's large grain. We look for large patterns. But these are like our state assessments, the big kind of ticket assessments or the district benchmark assessments that we do over time. But we also look at map data, the medium grain size, right? We're seeing streets and street names. This helps us identify gaps. And our map data is really our curriculum-based assessments, what teachers might be doing as a quiz or an activity to get more information. And then street data really is, what's the word on the street? This is fine grain, and we're really looking for students to share. So this is their portfolios, their reflections. This is what happens during student-led conferences. So when we talk about know students, and we think about the indicators, we're looking at our evidence and our data to know that we're making impact, that we're seeing improvement in the data set. So to begin with, we need to know who our kids are in terms of enrollment and demographics. So Mansfield's very diverse. We have 29 different languages spoken or represented in our schools right now. 29. We just did some interviews for the AP assistant principal position. We had one candidate say, well, I know Mansfield isn't really diverse. And afterwards, when we were debriefing, they're like, they don't know Mansfield, right? We are very diverse. And we see in our race and ethnicity that while we're predominantly white, we know that we have Latinx students, African American, Asian, Pacific Island students. And so that's part of this wonderful fabric. And that we know our size, the scale of it, as a district, as a school, and as a classroom. That's part of knowing students. We also know attendance, and I want you to look at this data and see if you spot a pattern. I'm sorry?
It's high.
Right, so that's good. We should be proud of that. But look further. And you'll see that last year, we see a decrease of attendance rates for all students. So we know the pandemic began in the 1920 school year, but we don't see an impact on attendance until 2022. So this is what data does for us. We become detectives. We have to think about, like, well, what was the impact on learning when we had less students in there? But also, what were our practices? We know that in 20 and 21, the state gave a lot of license to do remote learning. In 22, remote learning was no longer allowed. And so if you were sick, you were out. And so tracking attendance really became important. And so maybe we actually had more students out, but they were engaged in remote learning than we did in 2022. So you have to look at data and you have to think about, well, what is the story behind it?
Can I interrupt you for a second? Just to, like, I understand that language because I'm a teacher who did that, but maybe just like dive deeper that, can I just explain it to you guys? But teachers had to record, like if a student was out on quarantine with COVID and they signed in remotely, they were counted as attending school that day. So I didn't know if you guys.
Of course we did.
Okay, well, I just wanted to clarify that because that was like a really odd thing that happened, and there was so much controversy about like what it took to qualify a student as being in attendance, and I don't even know what Mansfield counted as that. Was that like, did you guys do any half-day stuff, or it was just if they signed in one time, they were counted for the full day? Like, I think all districts kind of did that differently, so
Right.
I'm not even certain.
Yeah, so we were consistent with the guidelines from the State Department of Education, and we looked for engagement that was at least more equal or greater to a half day of instruction, knowing that could be a combination of synchronous and asynchronous learning. There were generous allowances with it, and we felt that the State Department and our community was saying we're doing the best we can, and we engaged our families in many ways using online platform. The other pattern that you see is the high needs group. High needs are a subgroup that includes students with IEPs, 504s, free and reduced lunch, English language learners. It's a subgroup that we pay attention to because very often they are a vulnerable population that we need to think about. And we can see some data trends that they were comparable, but it would suggest that perhaps their attendance rates, their absentee rates rather, were higher in 20. Catherine?
Yeah, I was just going to say, has states said absolutely no remote learning? The reason why I'm asking is I realize I'm going elementary to college, but even at the college level, if someone calls or notifies their professor that they're out due to COVID or whatever, they have the opportunity to let that student remote into the classroom so that they are not missing their classes.
Yeah.
So is that just like absolutely?
It is absolutely against the law. And it's an example of what happens in the state legislature at the last minute, that this was a proposal that happened in the 11th hour of the last session. It was a complete surprise to superintendents and districts that were not even prepared nor invited to the discussion, that simply made dual instruction illegal, like it is no longer appropriate.
So how do we get that changed?
Your state legislature. We have to change state law. I know that we are looking at interpretations of the end of dual instruction, and there are some people who believe that the legislation actually refers to remote learning as a system, which is a practice that now should cease, versus when it's aligned to a need for a student who has an IEP or a student who's on a 504. So for example, if a student went through surgery, is susceptible to COVID or other infections, doesn't want to learn, can we create an individualized plan that allows that student to remote in? There are some attorneys and districts that are saying, yeah, that makes sense, and that's not the spirit of the law. What they were trying to do is end the practice of having a camera in a classroom and have that count as in-person learning. So I understood why they wanted that, but it's most unfortunate because it's caused us to pause a practice that we learned was actually really helpful for some students. Remote learning, while it wasn't great for all, it allowed us to continue to engage students, and it was a very helpful tool and can be a helpful tool. So there will be more to say on that on the state level, and we will navigate it as best we can, doing what's best for kids.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Someone who was in the class throughout the entire pandemic, I can tell you that there really is a difference between what happens when you have all your children with you or when you're trying to teach some children on a screen and some children who are with you. It's very difficult to make sure that you're really meeting the needs of all those children at that same time. And I think that's why the legislation came about, because we found that in some respects, everybody was losing something. And I do understand about last-minute legislation because, frankly, I don't need a half-hour lunch. But we have to consider what it is like when you are actually in the classroom. And what I believe Superintendent Dart is talking about is exceptions where that can be helpful. But to go back to those days of half of your kids in little squares and the others here is a very difficult way to make sure that you're really meeting the needs of all of your children.
And that's not what I was actually talking about. I was elaborating on what he said. I'm just talking about, you have a kid who comes down with COVID and is going to be out for 10 days. You don't want them to lose 10 days worth of things. So I'm talking about, I'm not talking about people who would rather be at home learning as opposed to in the classroom. I'm talking about special situations.
Okay.
So those kids didn't get left behind.
And I think, Jeanette, you raise an interesting point. I don't think any of us want to go back to those days where we have half our class or a whole class trying to Zoom in. My point is exactly what you said. It's addressing the one-off student who needs that support for a medical reason or for a specific learning, or even advanced placement courses. I know high schools are struggling where they were able to offer advanced placement courses because of remote learning that no longer can do that. So moving ahead, we know that also part of knowing students is looking at street data at climate. So what are our students saying at the elementary and the middle school? Overall, they're saying very positive things. Again, if you globally look at this, they feel safe, they're comfortable, they're talking to their families, they feel that work is interesting, that their teachers are encouraging. But there are smaller patterns within this that we look at and we contextualize and we ask ourselves, well, why are they saying that? That's part of that journey of using data. And maybe this is data that we use in Data Studio. If students are not doing well, do they like school? Maybe that is a correlation we want to look at that might be connected. So I want to now share our SBAC data. SBAC is the Sparner Balanced Assessment Consortium. This is the state test that's aligned to federal and state law. As a board, you've not looked at SBAC scores in a long time. And so we might go a little slower, and please ask questions. I want to share just a couple of parameters around this. That SBAC is given to students grades 3 through 8, given in the springtime. It's mostly computer adaptive assessment work. It's adaptive in the sense that a student can pause it, doesn't have to take it all in one seating. It measures progress, and it's aligned to college career readiness goals and the Connecticut core standards. It does help us evaluate. Again, satellite, large grain, we're looking at patterns, and we also triangulate data. That a student is never a number and is never based on one assessment. In fact, again and again, when we ask our community what's most important, the last thing on the list is SBAC. That I think our families understand that, yes, this is important, but it's not the total story, nor is it the district or a school or the classroom we want to send our kid to. However, it is super important to us because our core business is reading, is writing, is math, is all of those wonderful things, the related arts. And so we do want to look at how we measure and what it looks like. So let's take a walk through the data. And I want you to feel good as a Board of Education. I feel very proud that last spring, when our students took SBAC, when we look at an area comparison of districts and the state, that we outperformed. 73% of our students are at or above goal in ELA. This is all students combined, grades 3 through 8. We also saw that same pattern in math, that again, we outperformed the state and we outperformed our area schools. While these numbers, 62 for Mansfield, is not where we want to be, we have to look to the left and to the right. We have to contextualize it. We were coming out of a pandemic. We know there's learning loss. But to see that our students outperformed comparative students in other schools, other districts, we should be proud of that. But we should also pay attention to what worked and what didn't work, who had the learning loss. When we look at the overall longitudinal data over time, this is where you are going to see learning loss. So we know back in 2018, all students performing in ELA, we had 78% of our students at or above goal. Compare that to 22, we have 73. In mathematics, we were at 70 in 2018, 62% in 2022. And you can see during this time, there was a pattern that there was possible effect of the pandemic. That is quite reasonable to assume that learning loss occurred during that time based on this assessment. Keep in mind, Smarter Balance was not assessed in 2020. State Department waived it. That was, remember, March 13th when we closed school. And so the assessments did not happen. Catherine?
I love letters. What does NGSS mean?
Oh, you're ahead of me. I'm going to save that one. I'm going to come back because I have a teacher here who's going to talk about it. But it's Next Generation Science Standards, and it's our science assessment. We lump that in with SBAC. And there's a great story to be told about what's happening in science in the middle school. So I'm really excited about that. So when we start to disaggregate the data and look at grade level bands, again, comparing Mansfield to the state, we see now performance, but we don't see consistent performance across the grade levels. And we see that same pattern in mathematics. Outperforming the state, but some variability when we compare grade level to grade level. These are assessments that we give 3 times a year within the district, STAR, ELA, and STAR Math assessments. You've heard us talk about that. Those are benchmark assessments, and the Fontes and Pinnell reading assessment. And I included these not for you to look at the details of them, but to kind of blur your eyes and see the patterns that we triangulate between SBAC and these assessments that we give 3 times a year. These are somewhat predictive as to where our students are going to fall in that state assessment. But more importantly, because it's street data, or excuse me, map data, it's helping us drive instruction. And we give it 3 times a year, so we give it in the fall, we see it in the wintertime, and then the spring. Teachers are looking at this, and they are thinking, what can I do tomorrow based on this data? That's the best use of data, right? That it drives instruction. And here, Catherine, to your question, is the state science information. So when we look at Next Generation Science Standard assessment results, we see in grade 5, 83% of our students last year were at or above goal. That is tremendous. Last year, pandemic, that's tremendous. And then in grade 8, you see 77%. Keep in mind, NGSS science assessment is only given in grade 5 and 8. Now check out the longitudinal data, and you'll see why I'm excited about this. Here we see a trend over time in grade 5. We see that in the pandemic, a team was able last year to increase proficiency of students, or the number of students at or above. And I'm excited to have members of the 5th grade science team. Brenda Moulton is going to be here. Oh, there she is. You missed a great introduction. She got all verklempt and choked up. So come on up. Her partner, unfortunately, is not able to join us. But I was just bragging. Come on over and sit here, and Candace, and I'm going to weasel my way out. But we know that when we put our minds to it, when we use data, look at it, look at patterns, think about the assessment, but more importantly, think about the resources and tools and practices that when we are intentional, we can make a difference. And you've done a great job, and I'm very excited to have you here. So welcome.
And
I'm going to speak on first, only because I so appreciate the work that our science teachers engage in all grade levels in the middle school, looking back at Louis in 7th grade science. You've heard Peter talk about the next generation science assessment, and one thing that you may have remembered we've talked about in the past is that is a high cognitive demand assessment. In my opinion, it is one of the most rigorous assessments we have because of the way it's set up. And at some point, we should show you a little sample of it. It's an eye-opener. It really requires students to grapple with data. It also requires them to synthesize and analyze and make meaning of information that's presented in multiple panes within that assessment. And it is presented in what I'll call a very dense format. And so students have to not only use critical thinking skills, the math skills that they've gained in mathematics about how to interpret data, reading skills and thinking about how they interpret informational text. It's almost the trifecta of assessment because it's really asking them to apply all the skills that they've developed in all of the different areas, and then pull it all together on one assessment. And we recognize that in order to do that, there's some work involved in thinking about, from an instructional perspective, of how you design units of instruction that are really allowing students to be scientists, to think, act, and operate like scientists, because that's really the work of that assessment is asking them to do. And so I'm delighted that Brenda's able to be here tonight to talk through how in 5th grade we set up learning experiences that really put students not only in the center of their learning, but in ways that are rigorous and are relevant and meaningful. And so I'm going to turn it over to Brenda to speak.
Thank you so much for having me here tonight. Such a treat and a pleasure. First of all, I wanted to let you know that last year we did adopt 4 new science units that I think really helped us for students to see themselves as practicing scientists. The units were written by professors at New York University, and they integrated language along with science. And these, got it. No. These units were received These units received honors from the Next Generation Science Standards as top-rated units. Let me go back. Jumping the gun. There you go. So the 4 units that we adopted, we call the first one the garbage unit, and it's a physical science unit because the driving question for this unit is called, what happens to our garbage? So we start the year off with that. Then we get into our second unit, which we call the salamander unit. And the driving question is, why did the tiger salamanders disappear? And the third unit, we call it the water unit. But the driving question is, why does it matter if I drink tap water or bottled water? And then the last unit is, why do falling stars fall? All right, so for example, our garbage unit, all of the units start with an anchor with a phenomenon. So at the very beginning of our unit, we bring in a bunch of trash from the school cafeteria, which you've seen me digging through trash before. So we bring trash into the classroom, we put it out, and we have students go through the trash and sort it into different categories. So usually they want to just jump into recycling and non-recycling. And then we make them dig a little bit deeper and talk about the properties of the garbage. So why does recycling make recycling? Why does trash make trash? And we talk a lot about plastics. And then, we try to get them to understand that when the trash company comes and takes their barrels away, where does that trash go? And how does it affect our environment? Good shit. All right, so here you can see some students have different bins of trash from the cafeteria, and we wear safety goggles and gloves when they're doing this, but they're putting them into the different categories. And not only, like I said, do they learn trash or recycling, which they already know that, but they start to learn the term's properties, like how is plastic different than cardboard? And then we do have them talk about home trash versus school trash versus community trash, and see how like all the trash system works as a system, all the components together work as a system. And if you can see on the graphic there, they either all end up in a landfill or in the recycling center. So once they realize that, you know, what a landfill is and how terrible it is, and that landfills can be 85 feet high, full of trash, and there's been newspapers found in landfills that are 75 years old, and you can still read them. So they make their own landfill in the classroom, and you can see the students here had their landfill where they had food and non-food items in it. And students are testing their landfill for microbes, because one of our sub-questions is what happens to, why does it disappear? What happens to it over time? So within like a couple of months of our unit, obviously the plastic fork does not change, but the piece of bread they put in there might have changed, right? So like, how does it change? Why does that jar smell? What's making it stink? So they become practicing scientists. They're collecting data. They're analyzing their data that they're finding. They're interpreting their data, and they're forming conclusions and claims to questions that we pose to them. And in the end, that language piece that I said is tied in with the science units. They're writing scientific arguments. So they're taking a question, they're stating a claim, they've collected all their evidence, they're interpreting their evidence, and then they write a reasoning at the end. So we've really seen some huge growth in the science as scientists. And also the units really take simple things like what happens to your trash, right? And really dives deep into that and has some really tough, really good questioning for them as scientists to start questioning the world around them. And like Candace mentioned, we really should bring you in a sample of what the kids are asked to do in grade 5 on the Next Generation Science test. So we do also have a few things that we work out on top of our units. One of them is called Gizmos, and that's an interactive science lab where students can run simulations to solve different problems, which is very similar to how the NGSS tests are run with simulations. We also use a high-interest online video program called Generation Genius, and that helps us review the grades 3 and 4 concepts in science that the students are tested on. It's not just grade 5 that they're tested on 3rd and 4th as well. And we also do practice their NGSS interim assessments, so they get what type of questions. And thanks to Candace and the district and everyone, we now have big monitors that the kids can take their tests on, because they are split screens, a lot of words on them, so they have larger monitors to hook their Chromebooks to, and we do practice on them as well.
So one thing that we recognized is there's one process to science instruction of really allowing students to be practicing scientists, and then there's just the reasonable practical component of this assessment on a Chromebook doesn't really work, because they have to manipulate a left side screen and a data graph on the right and maybe answer questions down below. There's a lot that is required. And so we really started to have a conversation last year about what is a reasonable tool to make this manageable. And with the help of Louie and Jamie Russell, we were able to look at some portable options, and we've been able to purchase a classroom set of the what I call portable monitors that plug into Chromebooks that really help the landscape of the assessment. So those are tools to support. But what I really want to highlight is the Next Generation Science Standards really focus on science instruction that has units anchored in a real world problem that students can connect to. And then we utilize driving questions to drive that inquiry process. And as we go through the learning process with students and they conduct research and they collect data and they analyze, they ask more questions. And so it's through that questioning process that they become research-oriented and they're able to make meaning of the science. Yes, there's conceptual ideas that we teach into, but we teach into them as we work through the unit together. So it's different than how we may have learned in the past, where it was heavy content-based memorization of facts and details. And it makes, it's a really wonderful and authentic experience that kids are engaged in. And we are so appreciative to our 5th grade team, our 8th grade team, all of our science teachers who really embrace this approach. And it is fun to watch these kids be scientists every day. I mean, they are our innovators and our problem solvers. And that's a really important skill for our kids to have.
Absolutely. At the beginning of the year in 5th grade, we always ask students, what are the characteristics of a scientist? And so we brainstorm what they are. And over the years, I've asked them, what does a scientist look like? So back years ago, I used to get pictures of Einstein, right? Or men in white lab coats. And the past couple of years, it's been amazing because I've got pictures of kids drawing themselves, right? Or just, women or female or kids, So we really tried to make the point that we are all practicing scientists when we question the world around them. So if you're in the middle school, I just had all their pictures that they drew laminated, so they're going to be up all around the school. So if you're in the middle school, pop by the 5th grade hallway and you'll see their pictures of themselves as scientists now. Yeah, they're very cool. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Brenda. That was
you.
excellent. Thank you for your good work, too.
Thank
And
you.
congratulations on the scores. A lot to be proud of, Mr. Dart. Yes. Thank you. Peter, one thing that struck me as I'm sitting here tonight, and I think you should all be very proud of, is I imagine there are districts out there who take a look just at data and numbers and think that's getting to know the whole child. You guys got it.
That's exactly right.
That's it.
But it's because of the development plan. When we think about the knowing students, that it's not just data, it's what you do with the data, your understanding of it. And so that was just a high, powerful example of taking something like SBAC and NGSS that no one really likes to talk about. It is a huge cognitive demand on teachers and our students, and it takes a lot of energy. But when we look at the best of what that assessment does and turn it into how can we take that data point and improve instruction? How can we take what we know about kids who not only improve instruction, but think about their needs and how they work? We can turn that into just amazing, rigorous instruction. I was a former science teacher for many, many years, and I'm just envious, jealous, and I want to be in that class. So awesome job. Thank you, Brenda. And thank you, Candace. You're hearing from Candace a lot tonight, right? Obvious fit for a director of teaching and learning. Her presence in instruction and that vision that she has clearly is a great fit for us and has been a huge support for me. I want to go back to data, and I want to talk about our high needs subgroups. And again, we often look at data broken down even further, but we're careful that we don't do that in public and in ways that would be insensitive or inadvertently identify a student, a family, or a classroom. And so this high needs subgroup is a safer way to think about students who have traditionally been vulnerable to changes in education, to COVID, to the pandemic. They may have needs that exceed a traditional classroom. And so it is important to look at students who have IEPs and 504s, those who receive free and reduced meals, or are English language learners. And so they are lumped together, though I want you to know that we never lump them together. We don't think of them this way. They're kids, and they're perfectly beautiful and high achieving. Yet we know they're emerging readers, they're emerging thinkers and scientists. So here you see in ELA, when we look at all of our high need subgroups, that they are outperforming the state. That's awesome. However, you also can see, or you will see, that there is an achievement gap when we look at our kids compared to non-high need subgroups. But in both ELA and math, they're outperforming the state. But now when we look at that same group and compare them to all students, we see that there's an achievement gap. And so our job is to, one, acknowledge that. I often use the analogy of turning a log over and looking at the creepy crawly things underneath it. We've got to see that, own it, and then do something about it. So our job is to close that achievement gap. So our students with special needs or our students in this high need subgroup start to perform at similar levels or exceed those levels. So we see that pattern clear in both ELA and in mathematics across our grade level. Martha, you were asking before about longitudinal data, and we've been talking about the opportunity gap, achievement gap in terms of learning loss in the pandemic. So when we look at ELA data, we can also look at it not only traditionally by comparing third graders in 2019 to third graders in 2021 to 2022. Those are three very different groups of students. It's helpful for us to see that, but that's not comparing apples to apples. That's apples to oranges. They're different kids. So what we can do is we can look at cohort analysis or follow a grade level across the years. So we see from 21 to 22, grade 3 students going to grade 4 in 2022, their achievement in ELA, according to SBAC, increased. So that's another celebration. So during the pandemic, we see a cohort of students actually increasing proficiency. But we don't always see that. We do know that students and cohorts of students actually saw a decline in the number of students meeting or exceeding goal. And so as we unpack the data, as we learn about the data, we think about the student, contextualize the student, who they are as a learner, their families, and what is the best thing to meet their needs to move them forward. So we see the same comparison in mathematics. We can compare the grade levels across the year, or we can look at cohorts by looking at 6th grade students in 2021 as they move to 7th grade in 2022. Again, we see some achievement that really defies probably what people were expecting during and coming out of the pandemic, that we would see a depression of scores. We see increases. But as I pointed out before, it's not with all cohorts. And so we know that while some gain, some stayed about the same, and some decline. So identifying your own achievement gap or opportunity gap is important in knowing how to close that gap. And the key strategy of knowing students allows us to do that, coupled with a talented staff of teachers and educators who are dedicated to learning new practices, using new resources and thinking to meet their needs. So I end with that. I certainly would welcome questions, but I want to go back to our core beliefs and our 3 key drivers. The core beliefs are incredibly relevant. I hear again and again from people outside of our district that they are just amazed by them, and they love the 3 key drivers or strategies. That resonates with the work. It seems very authentic. But as you heard tonight, when we talk about no students, we're talking about equity. We're talking about active learning and building partnerships and growing educators. The data dashboard, the 5th grade science teachers, that's professional learning. We also know that when we share data and look at it together, that we're thinking about equity and how we support the whole child. So data and evidence is not just in no students. You'll hear and see data throughout the year during these reports of progress, but knowing students is where we begin. And while we haven't looked at SBAC so closely in so many years, I think it was refreshing and a reminder of how important data can be in the context of what we do and what we believe. So thank you.
Peter, one question as I'm thinking about. Are we changing anything in terms of how we communicate to parents about their progress in school? Is this in any way communicated to parents as well?
Well, so it is changing. It's evolving. And so we'll be sending home the SBAC reports as we are obligated to do with some traditional language around that. But each principal will contextualize that letter as they send it to their families. And we want to be careful not to think that that one report is more meaningful than anything else. And we're lucky that in general, Mansfield families know how to contextualize that, but we're ready to talk to the families of like, yes, let's look at that data. Let's look at your concerns, but also let's look at the bigger picture. This is why student-led conferences are going to be so important to us, and the portfolios and the artifacts, the non-traditional kinds of evidence that we need to capture. When I think of, I'm going to go back to that project, the Witness Stone, that 8th graders did in the spring. If we were to look at just numbers, what would that look like? The score that you received on an art project or on an essay, that's pretty flat. But when you listen to kids talk about it and when you read their reflections about it, I was just amazed. Their perception, their connection and feelings of how relevant that was to the world and their understanding of slavery and enslaved people was just life-changing to them. But it would have been completely hidden by a score. So point well taken. It is our work, and we know that when we grow educators, we also have to continue to build the partnerships with our families so they understand this. Part of our work this year will be looking at our progress reports and slowly crafting them so they're more relevant to our work and what we want to talk about and the performance of our students. It'll be hard, right? Because some families want to know, did I get an A on it? Did I get, what does this B mean? Well, it doesn't mean much, but if we pair it with ideas of portfolios and student reflections, that's street and map data, it becomes a little more relevant.
That's excellent. Thank you.
Martha?
Mentioned parent conferences. Each family, they get a small portfolio of their child's progress so they can take it home and reflect and ask more questions if they,
So
I assume there's a 15-minute time slot or something like that.
Yeah, you're right. So
10
you have to
10
get
or
all your
15
kids
minutes is-
through.
Yeah, or less if the person in back of you,
Yeah.
like we were shoved out so many times. But anyway,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
because I'm in a hurry. But anyway, I assume each family group gets a portfolio of their child's progress so that and it's discussed briefly and then the parent can reflect and ask more questions.
Sure. Well, so know that we're building the plane while flying it. And so we're building the portfolios now, and we're growing capacity with student-led conference. So I don't want the board to think that every single family, every single student will have this beautiful portfolio in a student-led conference, because we have pre-K students all the way to grade 8. So we will continue to look at the early implementers. We're engaging our teacher leaders to study more and research about districts that have been doing this longer than we have, to look at ways to do exactly what you're sharing, Martha, and that is to be more intentional about sharing these portfolios and engaging our families before the conference, so it's not all at once. But what's more important than the family's voice and the teacher's voice is we want the student to articulate what they've learned. Gone are the days that we save bad news or important talks for conferences. Our families should be talking to our educators all the time, using our apps, using emails, visiting, calling. We want to use these times so that they are looking at the portfolio and reflecting exactly what you're sharing. So it'll take time for us to get there, but I think that's part of the vision.
Any other questions? This was excellent, everyone. It just gives us such a deeper insight into what what work is going on in the district. We really appreciate all the time that you take to present this to us. Just excellent.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
I definitely want to thank my team, Candace especially, who spent a lot of time, as you can tell, and tonight, and did a lot of the work on the data for this presentation. That was great. I also just want to share, for the first time in our development plan, all the pictures are our kids. We're not using any clip art, which we did last year. And one of our moves, in order to get our parents and our families more engaged, is we've hired professional photographers to come in at various times to capture the essence of what we do. And of course, with the sensitivity and permission with our families, to better showcase what it looks like to be a Mansfield kid. And so that end user experience as a student, I see quite clearly in these photos already, and I look forward to being able to share with the board more of that work. That's the kind of fun project that we. Edith?
Peter, I just want to say how impressive this transformation of the development plan has been, and how this presentation kind of brought a lot of things to life that were a little flat on the page in the past. And I really appreciate you bringing people, real people in who have worked on this to talk to us. And that was also incredibly impressive.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah,
thank you.
I mean, I think this is a real step forward for us.
But
Thank
we
you.
also want to bring in students at some point, so
Yeah.
stay tuned, because they're real people, not like the
Catherine?
fake people like us. Catherine?
Just want to compliment Brenda, because for years I have been saying, please let kids build the volcanoes. Don't let them read about it. So instead of a volcano, we built a landfill. And I'm really, really happy to see that it's really hands-on, because I think that's the best way kids learn. Very welcome.
Thank you. Agreed.
Thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate it. All right, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Thank you, April. Thank you, Kath. Any objections to adjourning? 8:40. Thank you very much, everyone.